So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our first open dialogues. And this time we have an English presentation that's somewhat new for our event, but that's for a very, very, very good cause. We're honored to have here Professor Margot Hurlbert that's going to talk a little bit about climate risks in Latin America. Professor Margot is a professor in Canada Research Chair, Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability Policy of the Johnson's Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy in the University of Regina. That's right. She explores the gap between what is needed to address climate change and the current policy and behavior. And Margot's scholarship concerns climate change, energy, indigenous people, sustainability policies, and achieving net zero emissions in the forms of policy briefs, sharing circles, school events, and water talks. She has led and participated in many interdisciplinary research projects, and she serves on the editorial boards of international journals. She's a senior research fellow of the Earth Systems Governance Project. Margot was coordinating lead actor of a chapter in a special report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on Land in 2019, and a review editor and contributing author in the IPCC's RC6. She also worked on Future Earth's Earth Commission Working Group on transformations and as an expert panel member on adaptation for the Canadian Climate Institute and on the research board of the World Meteorological Organization. We are very pleased to have here sharing her thoughts and her work on this subject and opening the Dialogos Abiertos of 2025. And we'll have some time to explanation, and we hope to have lots of questions and a very fruitful discussion here. So, Professor Margot, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. You can hear me and see my slide. It looks fine. So I hope to talk for about 20-25 minutes. I'm going to kind of go quickly and leave lots of room and time for discussion. So this is a project that includes Canada, but it also has South American partners, and I'll speak briefly to that. But first of all, acknowledge that I am sitting on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory in Canada, which is very important to us here in Canada. If you've heard any of the geopolitics going on in the west of Canada, there's talk of wanting to join Trump's 51st state, but the Indigenous people, because of treaty, won't allow it because of their inherent Indigenous rights and treaties with the Crown would prevent any of that happening. So we acknowledge these lands and our shared lands and the agreements that we've made that are binding for time immemorial. I'm going to talk a little bit about this project, who we are, some of our objectives, and then some of the findings in South America and Canada. So just kind of an overview. We have teams that I'll show you briefly working in Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, in addition to Canada. So these teams are, first of all, in Uruguay, led by Nestor Mazeo at CERAS and Marco Billy at the University of Chile, and then at CONACET in Argentina, Elma Montaña and Paulo Mussetta. So I'm showing you information and findings, not only from, of course, the directors, but there's a research team standing behind populating all of this data of these directors. And this is just a synopsis of the researchers that are in Canada. I won't go through each and every one of them, but they notice that they are very interdisciplinary. We have engineers in the bottom right, Dr. Shahid Azam, and in the top we have climatologists, But we also, this is a social science project. It's led and orchestrated and imagined by social scientists, which makes quite a big difference, I find. In Chile, the team, you see them before you, is again large and very interdisciplinary, as well as the Argentinian team that you see here, but led by Jorge Ivars, Paula Musetta, and Elma Montaña. So the objectives of this project that I should acknowledge is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada is to identify risks. And these are risks defined broadly as AR6, the IPCC started to define risks, recognizing the interconnections of climate risks with other global change risks that are happening. And we wanted to focus on 4 sectors. So the ecosystems, our natural systems, our economic activities, our livelihoods of small producers in agriculture, and as well as our infrastructure, and thus the reason to be including engineers in our project. So after identifying risks, we wanted to assess the adaptation that's happening in all of these countries and the governance that's either facilitating adaptation or acting as a barrier to adaptation. And then in order to develop sustainable pathways into the future, we're interested in exploring different pathways and really the tensions between choices and decision-making in adaptation. And to do that, as social scientists and humanities scholars, we feel that underlying values that inform adaptation decisions are highly important, keenly important. So we want to look at these. So these are our overarching objectives. And of course, like all good research scientists applying for federal government funding, we made a great diagram. And it was actually mostly the Argentina crew of Elma Montaña that built this project objective outline, which basically says exactly what I just relayed to you on the previous slide. But this is the detailed map that our interdisciplinary team can align with and see where they're specifically contributing on our 8 objectives that we outlined for this study. And you'll notice on the left-hand side, we have interdisciplinary practice, and on the right-hand side, we have transdisciplinary practice. So we started with building a very transdisciplinary platform with government and civil society organizations. In Canada, we have about 23 partners, which include the federal government, the provincial government, the local governments, the local watershed bodies, some of the environmental organizations, as well as agricultural producer associations. So we have a overarching snapshot of these institutions, and Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay each have their own equally robust set of partners in each country. So we started with the platform. We amassed all the literature. Many of us have been working together and have been working in these basins for a few decades. So we started with our students coming up to speed on the literature that exists already in these basins in Objective 2. But then in Objective 3, we started the social science of exploring in an ethnographic manner with people in the 4 sectors that I mentioned, their climate change risks and interconnected risks. We want to look at governance and government policy and how it helps or how it hinders. And our climate modelers are working, and we're working actually with Anna Sorensen from Argentina to develop climate storylines, which are infographics, I'll call them, 2 or 3 pages that speak to what the future climate's going to be like in our 4 countries. So we're working on those as we speak. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we've found, because that's the stage of the project that we're at right now. It's a 5 or 6 year project. We're halfway through, and we're starting on values assessments and building objectives 7 and 8, the sustainable pathways to the future. So we have not yet developed our sustainable pathways. This is actually the Argentina Objective 2 summary in the next 2 slides. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read it all to you. But part of the reason I'm using Elma Montaña and Paula Maceta's slides is because they actually are interestingly reflective of very similar dynamics that go on in Canada, but also in Chile and Argentina, where we've got these incredible variations in temperature here in Saskatchewan. We're also having glacier retreat in Alberta, which is the headwaters for our river, changing precipitation regime, where snow is moving to rain and it's happening in a different season. We've got these extreme weather events I'll talk about a little bit more in the upcoming slides. We have emerging issues of tourism in Uruguay, especially, as well as Argentina and Chile, where we're working. Territorial planning is very much pro-urbanization in many of our countries, which is creating risks and problems in and of itself, very different. Mining is also stressing our environment, our ecosystems, but advancing our primary economic activities. Water scarcity, we have crop irrigation happening in Chile, Argentina, and Canada, and many are developing pathways into the future of adding on to irrigation. So again, some of the main non-climate risks and climate risks have been mapped out and identified, and some of the governance practices are accentuating these risks, including lack of adequate regional planning and lack of investment in infrastructure, and also, interestingly, in Argentina, as well as the other countries, vandalism and insecurity is on the rise. So those risks, what we've found is in our ethnographic interviews that these risks are happening in compounding manners, but also interconnected and cascading manners. So we're having floods, which are also resulting in more insects, more storms, more hail in the fall in Canada, wind, and a real change in our first and last frost, which actually feeds into aridity of our soil, depending on when these frosts occur and when the rainfall also occurs. So our drought, we've in Canada been in a 5-year drought, and in the South American countries of Argentina and Chile, 10-year plus droughts. We're experiencing more heat domes, and contributing to some of the stresses of climate is some of our practices that we've evolved of continuous cropping, minimum tillage, and cover cropping, which actually, with the higher temperatures and greater aridity of our soils, gives rise to more fire hazards because there's more foliage laying on the land because of these changing dryland agricultural practices, which are mostly occurring, of course, in Canada and Uruguay, and lesser extent happening in Argentina and Chile, where agriculture is mostly irrigated. So fire has become much more of a concern. You'll see following the news in North America, we, over this weekend, have just had a few more fires already in the spring, which is highly unusual to start having fires for us in May, but they're happening. And the Zondo winds happening in Argentina and the winds happening here, in combination with some of these climates, are creating new and different and exponential risks on the landscape. And what we're finding in Canada specifically is we used to go through periods of drought and periods of flood. We still have that seasonal variability with La Nina and El Nino of dry periods and wet periods, but we're having at the same time, and I borrowed from our climatologist, David Sachin, cited these Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada maps, and you'll see in the black we're having extreme drought, but we're also having at the same time extreme moisture in some of our areas. So we've got lakes in Saskatchewan that have actually increased in size, but at the same time, we're having extreme drought on our semi-arid agricultural land. So we're experiencing, to a greater degree, both of the climate extremes simultaneously. We've also discovered, and these are Canadian findings, but they are also happening to greater or lesser extent in our South American countries, where we're having, because of the extreme flooding, drainage in agriculture has become extremely important, but our environmentalists want to have wetland conservation. And there's a tension going on in Canada, especially, but also in South America in relation to agricultural drainage versus wetland conservation. And as social scientists, as we explored these tensions, we, in our interviews with agricultural producers and municipal leaders, we were actually taken aback after being in the field for over 2 decades as researchers, the amount of polarity and the truth and truthiness and the allegation of bias against individual researchers and their findings in relation to that drainage and wetland conservation was actually really quite notable for us as scientists, because it's not something that has come up in previous decades, especially in relation to science and our science teams. So the conflicts happening on the ground and the conflicts between big agriculture and going big and bigger farms versus small agriculture are quite prevalent. Irrigation expansion is a big issue in Canada as well as other areas. The diversity of the drought, apportionment during a hydrological drought or a lack of water coming down the river, loss of civil society watershed groups, and also in adaptation, we're always doing adaptation planning. We seem to get lots of funds to do the planning, but very few funds to actually implement the solutions. So one thing in that polarity of science that's become quite evident in Canada, and I'm not so certain we need to explore it more in South America, is just this conflict on the landscape. The engineers talking about the contribution, or actually the lack of contribution, of agricultural drainage to flooding versus the natural scientists, the soil scientists, stating that agricultural drainage and the loss of wetlands is contributing to flooding. So we're hearing scientists say polar opposite statements, and thus the allegation by agricultural producers, community members, of institutional, university, and science bias. So I've spent several months trying to figure this out, and it actually, in my opinion, is that both are true. In the engineers' world, we have these prairie potholes in Saskatchewan that fill, and once they're full, they're like a bathtub and they overflow. Because of the retreat of glaciers in the last ice age, our topography is full of these prairie potholes, so to speak. So the engineers have mapped how the potholes drain into one another, and they're very accurate when they say that the pothole is full and it's going to spill into the next pothole. But the natural scientists, the soil scientists, the agronomists are also true, very accurate and true, in that if we're in a 1 in 25-year drought and a wetland exists, it will prevent flooding downstream into a neighbor's by retaining that water and adding to our natural ecosystem and will prevent that flooding. So both are right, but in today's day, they're talking past one another is what I find. So I think this is an important thought for how we go about developing adaptation in the future. And it's really just one example of this polarity of science that we found on the landscape, but I use it to illustrate some of the tension and conflict that's happening and preventing, I think, really good adaptation planning into the future. So this is just kind of the social science take on what's happening. Each of the practices are important. So we drain because of flooding. And we drain in order to continue to have agricultural production. And of course, community and producer livelihoods depend on the ability to flood or to drain after flooding to both protect soil against salinity, but also be able to farm it in the upcoming crop season. And in drought, it's important to have wetland conservation. So environmentalists and many medium to small producers are very pro wetland conservation, including the cattle farmers. It has many benefits. So our civil society groups of farmers, environmentalists appear to be pitted against one another, but the reality on the topography or geography is very different. This also gives rise because generally large producers are the ones that are highly technical and draining and using extremely large equipment and want to level most of those potholes so that they're easier to farm. Whereas small agricultural producers tend to have a bit more cattle or beef. They're not over leveraged and they tend to like the natural landscape. So this tension that exists in relation to drainage and flooding also leaches or moves over into tension and a dispute on the landscape about which government policy should be addressed for adaptation purposes, whether it's small or large agricultural producers. And again, irrigation, I'm starting to run out of time and I won't talk a lot about this, but a lot of pros and cons, and whether it really benefits everyone or only benefits the few that are going to be using the irrigation. There's a lot of interconnections of the issues that I've been talking about in relation to what are very different debates going on the landscape between drainage, irrigation, large farms. But underlying these tensions are some very explicit, actually implicit, I'll change that word. They're hidden. The actual values of the people that are making the adaptation decisions. And Alejandra Rojas from Chile actually developed this back in 2000. So a few decades ago in one of our first IDRC and Tri-Council Canada funded projects, just showing the values in quadrants divided, but they actually aren't as divided. But we can map certain of our adaptations by the values that they reflect. So the big agricultural corporation is in the top left-hand corner. It derives its profit, its motivation is in the market. And the smaller agricultural producer that sells to local markets, which happens in South American economies as well, tends to value place and the bottom right hand and a bit more society. So they tend to operate in different trajectories of these values cycles. So by understanding the values of our agricultural producers and our community members, it allows us to have a deeper conversation about how to adapt into the future through value-based discussion. Because when values come into it, it's very unusual that someone would be, as a person contributing to a conversation, would want to reside in only one of those quadrants and not recognize some importance of their surrounding quadrants. So we move past this polarity and this dispute between polar opposites that might get expressed in interviews, but can come together when we do some adaptation planning, as we intend to do in the future. So this was put together by one of the students working on our project, and she was looking at ecosystems. She's actually got a master's in biology and is working on her master's in public policy, and noted kind of the different values that are playing out in the ecosystem in Saskatchewan. And you'll see in the top right, the society values. We are the home of Medicare. Oh boy, it's getting to be 85, 90 years ago. We have a government Medicare system. We very much support society, and we still do, though, have market values with some of our grain and livestock producers. People represent autonomy or individualistic values. There's very much idea that as an agricultural producer, you are able to adapt, and the obligation of adaptation is on you. We say the way the West was built on initiative and the individual. But there's also very much a local place-based value system, especially recognizing our Indigenous people that I started out talking about and I will end up talking about. So this has been a very interesting learning experience as the director of this project. In Canada, we're on a journey of reconciliation with our Indigenous people. So as social scientists, we take into account inequality, as well as the important place of Indigenous people in our research. So we've tried to develop that in South America as well, with lesser or greater or lesser success, but I can talk about that if there's a discussion on it later. But we're working with some First Nations here and have gotten some extra funding to work on Indigenous water sovereignty with the First Nations in Saskatchewan. But one of the most telling reflections of one of our elder, when we were Aaron Hillis, the student that's working on ecosystem, the biologist, and our First Nations community, and looking at infrastructure and drinking water, plants that clean drinking water. And our elder said this quote that I have in the purple box in the middle, and she just sat back and looked at us and said, "You mean to tell me we just spent millions of dollars on a water treatment plant for something Mother Earth used to do for us for free?" So I find the Indigenous knowledge as a social scientist is just incredibly telling. And we learn so much from the relational, the spiritual, and the practices of ethics from our Indigenous people that can inform a lot of the adaptation pathways that are possible into the future for transformation. So we're really at this really important juncture. We've got 2-3 years ahead of us. And in that, we really want to do a good job of exploring values with people and exploring at the same time with Anna Sorensen working on these climate storylines of what's going to happen in our landscapes into the future that would allow us to bring these polarized views into a common forum, but a safe and secure common forum of discussion of a hypothetical future climate that's going to happen in the future, but a real on the landscape adaptive decision making to build pathways. So we're right at that stage of developing objective 5 on values that you see here, 6 on hydroclimatic risks, and building those integrative social ecological system adaptation pathways into the future of transdisciplinarity. So that's all I have. I'm just a couple minutes over, but I think we still have lots of time for questions and discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Margot, for your presentation. It was really inspiring to hear your project and we can have a very nice Q&A session right now. If anyone has some question or some clarification or some point would like to mention, please feel free to write on the chat, or you can open up your microphone and just jump in. And if no one has any question, I have my questions of my own. That's... So maybe I can just start by telling that, oh, okay, I think I'll let Andres, if you want to speak, if you just jump in and turn on your mic.
Okay, thank you, Margot, for your presentation. I also found very inspiring. I would like to ask about the South American partners, if you can more or less generalize about the risks that you found in these countries, to generalize to other countries in Africa or South Asia. Just if you found something that is generalizable. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andres. It's a great question, and actually, yes, I find how can I state this? The compound and interconnected risks. It's amazing to me. Then that's why I used Argentina's slides. It's exactly the Canadian case, but they've been found or discovered in the Argentinian ethnographic research, Mendoza, Argentina, I should point out, case. And they're exactly what's going on in Canada, but also they resonate in both Chile and Uruguay. So this drought and flood and fire, and we're all dry land agriculture. So we're not on coastal. This is not a coastal situation. So definitely that type of coastal inundation, sea rise, is not part of these case studies. So dry land agriculture, and we're all in areas that risk desertification because we're semi-arid basins. So the geography is very similar. Uruguay and Canada have more connection because we have a more dry land agriculture. And our topography is actually quite similar, and we have problems of water quality, algal blooms, and the similar drivers. It was amazing to me. We met in Uruguay one year, and the same crops are being grown, the same practices for agriculture, which are giving rise to the same risks, experienced slightly differently. And to me, it was fascinating that the researchers didn't necessarily see at the beginning of the project the similarities until we get further down the project. And for instance, fire. In Canada, we're always talking about fire because we have so many fires, and very little resonating with our Chilean or Uruguayan, for sure, researchers. But then we were in Chile a few years ago, and there's raging fires going on, and the Canadians are going, see? And the Chileans are going, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You know, and these are social scientists. So I find just the amount and depth we learn from working together in this sustained funding project. It really, we learn so much from one another, and we see risks that aren't in our consciousness necessarily as researchers or working with government. I'm at a policy school, and when we start pointing to other areas where these risks are happening in the same interconnected manner, we learn so much. So really, that drought and flood, again, little resonance in Mendoza, Argentina, to talk about the flood because they have so little water, or Chile even, but it's starting to be more noticeable with climate change to have these these floods that are happening for us in our winter, and also happening at different ways and shapes in South America because of the changing water regime. So great question. And I think we can do a lot more in this North America, Central America, South America to really get some really good knowledge about how our interconnected weather and climate system is changing.
Yeah, thank you. And just a fast follow-up question about the social risks, because maybe the social risks could be different about the inequality between countries in South America and this inequality that may appear between the indigenous and another part of the society in Canada.
Absolutely. Yeah. So interestingly to me, Argentina had the large versus small, and I've worked with Chile for decades, and they're the same thing. And I actually used to think that they were very different in the sense that the large agricultural producers in Mendoza, Argentina sell internationally, and the small ones are unable to sell internationally, right? They're almost legally prevented. And that doesn't exist in Canada, but it kind of does because our small producers sell at farmer markets and they sell into cooperatives. So I'm actually, the more I work with South America, the more I can see they're not exactly the same, the social inequality, and they're definitely key differences. And the Indigenous one is one of the big ones. It's incredibly different what we practice and how we research and the work we do in Canada with Indigenous people, and then South America. And that has been, for me, in the last 3-4 years of working on this project, I've learned a lot more than I used to know about South American Indigenous people. Because there are Indigenous people in South America, in Chile and Argentina, and even in Uruguay, but not really recognized, not organized, and often it's local communities, right, that represent Indigenous people, but they're really not like Canada, where it would be an Indigenous First Nation or Indigenous chief that we would look to, and in South America, it's very different. And challenging in its own way. So the inequalities are different. I can write similarities, which I tend to like to do, but dissimilarities is really important as well. I don't know. I think it's important to maybe have that discussion, more of that discussion. And I hope as we do, and it's more an academic comparison, because we're all trying to build adaptation, transdisciplinary adaptation plans, right, that'll solve climate change. But those differences, I think, if we're going to address poverty, I think exploring those differences and the dynamics is very worthwhile, right, if we're going to address poverty. But I won't be me, the Canadian, coming down to South America. Do you know what I mean? This is where the South American can address South American poverty, and in Canada we have poverty for sure, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Great questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Andres, for your questions, and Margot for your considerations. Gonzalo has written a question in the chat. Maybe you want to ask it directly, Gonzalo, or I can read it for you if you want.
All right, let me get my chat up.
Okay, I can read it here. So, okay, no problem. I'll read it for you, Gonzalo. Gonzalo just asked if is there a very different perception of risk and adaptation needs between different countries, considering a developed society and developing countries?
Excellent question. And you know what? I am not sure I'm comfortable answering this because we haven't had an inter-country comparison that would be specific to this question. And we're really talking to people about climate change risks how should I say this? We used to, in Canada especially, when 20 years ago we talked to agricultural producers, we would never use climate change. We would talk about flood and drought and the climate risks of flood and drought. But a lot of Western Canada and the United States, the rural people aren't really engaged in climate change science. And there was a lot of climate change denial. There still is some climate change denial in Canada. So to me, when we talk about differing perceptions of risk, that's kind of a key barrier, right? If people don't believe in climate change in Canada, it's really hard to have them engage with the risk of climate change into the future. Having said that, I don't think South America, from my knowledge in the interviews that have ever happened or are happening now, you have the same level of climate change denialism. But that's very, very different to say then that Canada's at more risk because our rural agricultural producers have an issue with climate change because they're of a right-wing persuasion. So I don't think that's a fair way to describe it, because in Canada, there's so much access to economic wealth, loans. There's so much available to agricultural producers. And we're not through the governance assessment in Uruguay, Argentina, or Chile. But last time I was in the field 8 years ago, Chile and Argentina didn't have the same level of agricultural producer support as Canada. So would we say then that the agricultural producers in Chile and Argentina were more at risk and had less adaptation because of that? So it's kind of with risk, it depends on the lens and what we consider the most important lens for describing risk and describing adaptive capacity, which is the access to those capitals that we've studied since 2001, the IPCC report, where we need human capital, we need social capital, we need economic, like money capital, we need infrastructure, we need technology, right? So how those differ between the countries, I think makes a difference. And I'm sure there's some great inter-country comparison work we'd love to do, but our main objective is to build these pathways of resilience, right, for our countries and learn from one another. Yeah, with time and energy, it would be great to do some inter-country comparison and learn about that. So great question. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Gonzalo and Professor Margot. Professor Monica, you have a question, please. I think your audio is off.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Margot, thanks a lot for your presentation. I have just like a curiosity question. You mentioned that you mentioned all the risks that you have identified during this time of the research project. And they are not very different from, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago. But the interesting my point of view is that you acknowledge now that they are interconnected and cascading risks. And I think that's really, really relevant. So I just wanted to ask you whether you are taking into account this interconnection and this systemic understanding of risks for the previous phase of your research, which, as I understood, it will be related to suggesting adaptation strategies. So how can you include like this systemic perspective into the recommendations that you will get in the end in this project?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Monica, because I think it's really important as we build adaptation pathways to the future. So my opinion, when we silo anything, when we silo disciplines, engineers versus agrologists or soil scientists, I think it leads to very challenging results, right? And personally, as a social science governance person, I'm fascinated, and I can spend a whole day with researchers hearing different pieces of science and trying to picture it together and having a dialogue, but lay people don't have that capacity or interest. And they just shake their head, and it confirms for them their confirmation bias that us researchers in our ivory tower have no real clue what's happening on the landscape, and we can't help them. But, or the opposite happens is what I found. I found in our case studies in South America and here, the community or people will align with one researcher who they think is a hero. And that one researcher, whether it's a climatologist or a biologist or an engineer, becomes their authority on everything. And then they only see it, their community or the person in government, they only want to analyze their problems of drought or flood through that one science lens. So let's pretend it's engineering. And engineering is a great profession, it's a great discipline, and they have an ethics of building technology safely, which is really important, but they miss so much science. So I'm just firmly of the belief that if we're going to add value to pathways into the future, we have to break down silos, in mining versus agriculture, silos of biology versus engineering. We have to break down those silos and have these discussions, and also then do it so that people aren't turned off by our debates, because as scientists, we love to debate. That's what we do, but we need to do that at the university. And then when we're in the field working on these sustainable adaptation pathways, we need the right team of people there that will work together and not have these disputes that just don't allow adaptation to advance and reconcile. And it comes down to respect for all disciplines. There's not a discipline, like biologists don't have it wrong and engineers don't have it wrong, but we need to actually robustly work together. And I will say, like, the global environmental change, the IAI, the Inter-America Institute, they do a wonderful job of bringing disciplines and science together, right? So we need to support these institutions that are doing this. And as researchers, we volunteer our time and our passion to do that. So I just think it's really a great point you make, Monica, that we really need to put our effort into this really, really important practice. And I know it's important as young professors, young academics embarking to get our name and our publications in our discipline. We have to do that, but we also need to expand our horizons into that science and policy space of working together and seeing these risks as compound and cascading, and so important to be working with the social scientists and working with the climatologists.
Great, thank you, Monica, for the question and the very interesting reflection, Professor Margot. Anyone has any other question that would like to share right now? Or maybe I would like to share a question, a concern of mine regarding this issue. We just was talking right now because I was just thinking if there is any. I'm not pretty sure if your work is right in this moment that could share some kind of illustration or case of how do you are working to create those shared ecosystem values, building these pathways, especially regarding this breaking silos you were just talking. How the researchers are in the field working to break in like an objective manner or like a kind of recommendation besides thinking of what we should do or how are you doing that? Is there any thoughts you could share with us?
Oh, you just hit the $1 million question, Raphael.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
$10 million.
So we're having this discussion because I actually think it depends a little on our research teams and their expertise and their comfort level, right? Whether they feel that they can tackle these tensions, right? So if I'm a biologist and I've only been practicing as a university biologist for 5 years or 3 years, I might not, but I might feel comfortable exploring these tensions in an open-minded manner. So a couple of rules that I see is, first of all, the other discipline and our lay people, our partners that are interested in climate adaptation, they don't want 100 pages and they don't want to sit through a 3-hour presentation of detail, right? So we have to make this more simple and understandables, which I hope I did with my agricultural drainage and the prairie pothole versus the wetland. Like, I think with a few well-crafted pictures, we can get at the heart of what the science sees differently, and then the complexity of someone's landscape can be kind of more of an illustrative discussion. So we need to break down the complexity to be more simple. We need to be open-minded and curious. And I think we need to visit the tension using examples that won't inflate anger. So for us in Canada, we have what I hope are some historical floods of 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where we could look and not to resolve who's right or the truth, because it's not about, that's exactly the point. It's not truth. This is not truth and truthiness. This is how can we explore in a simple manner. So a simple historical event timeline where here's where the flooding started, here's what got flooded, here's the opinion of the engineer that says this, here's the opinion of the ethnographic study that says the exact opposite. And it's not about finding out who's right, it's just illustrating that there were different opinions, and there's actually a whole bunch of data that we don't have, nor do we even want to go look at, that that kind of illustrates why there's differing opinions. And how would we do better in the future? Instead of having lawsuits and watershed disruption and conflict, how would we do better in the future if this were to happen? And as a recovering lawyer, I can tell you, people bring lawsuits when their voices are not being heard and they're being marginalized, right? And that's how we get attention for the environmentalist that hasn't been heard, or the agricultural producer who's having water drained on their land. So if we want to prevent lawsuits that are very expensive and very time consuming, right? How do we do that? How do we pay it back so that we're paying into the future to prevent that? And I think not everybody's going to want to be part of that conversation. So there will be people that just do not want to participate. And as a social scientist, thinking about the dynamics of power in advance, and what I've told my team is we will not be having a public debate of these two scientists. This is not our methodology. So we'll talk to individuals, we'll talk to discussions with certain actor groups, And going forward, I'm not exactly certain, but I actually think at the end of the day, we might have an Indigenous celebration of our Mother Earth. And at that point, we will highlight all of the different perspectives and the alternative pathways going into the future. And that starts our discussion of identifying pathways and not necessarily judging which is right or wrong, but identifying these pathways and the trade-offs. And it'll be people I've already heard from one research scientist when they are part of our team and they saw this complex risk and dynamics playing out. They said, gee, I'm going to change my behavior. And I thought that is a win. You know, just one acknowledgement from one scientist that we need to change our own behavior, I think is a win. To me, that's, you know, I've made my day. I've achieved success.
It's great. Thank you for your thoughts. It's really like $1 million question that we are asking ourselves here as well, and it's very good to hear from you. Does anyone have any other question or consideration? No? Oh, okay. Oh, Andres, please go ahead.
I do, because Margot, you mentioned in your research about this difference that has between the social researchers and the engineers. I don't know if it's researchers or developers. Have you seen any research in that direction about understanding what are the difference in more about not only the technology, but the conceptual or the theoretical issues that they are facing against each other? I ask this question because I'm doing more or less the same in my research, but between, for example, in just one case study in Colombia about what the public side thinks about one of the road mass to decarbonize, for example, road freight transport, and what public side, what private side thinks about the same issues. And we put it together in workshops, in some of the trying to understand what they think about and what is the difference. And we came to a typology about 3 things. They were talking about the roles and responsibilities. They were talking about for example, the egg chicken problem, that what is causing one problem, or what is causing the solution, or what is first, and what the prioritization of solutions. And also we were talking about I don't remember the deal one, sorry, and it's my research. I just
Yeah,
and the deal one was about
go ahead.
we tried to typologize. I just remember because you mentioned they agree, they both are true, and we also find in our research that. So we have like too much difference, and at the beginning they have like the half of them they agree on everything, but then they don't agree in another ones, and we try to make a typology. So I just was asking if you know about some examples or some papers about this research ongoing between difference between two groups, for example. Sorry if it's a large question.
Yeah, no, it's $1 million question. So, and there's whole branches of science, like the socio-technological studies, I think is at the STS conference. There's a socio-technical conference that happens every year in Graz, Austria. There's a whole bunch of scholars, even in the United States, Canada, that are engineers, and they pursue kind of a social technical studies, but it's led by engineers. But it's still a really good start to try and bridge this. Even if you Google my name, you'll find some stuff on the split ladder of participation, which is this, how we frame problems and how we divide disciplinarily differently. But more from a policy framing and public participation aspect. So there is a very deep scholarship, and then by topic, right? By whether it's water or whether it's the other area I work a lot in is energy, that we're not talking about here, where the technology and the perceptions are even more rigid around power production. So, and that really informs something. There's a lot of parallels, but it's a lot more divided in the energy field. So if you're looking for some deep literature that and the socio-technical regime change around power production and energy, you'll find some great frameworks. Yeah, great question.
I already found these frameworks, just asking more about some other empirical research like yours, but also thank you.
Yeah, so check mine out because it's more climate change than those social technical frameworks. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
So thank you again, Andres. Thank you, Professor Margot. In the interest of time, I think we are already ahead of our schedule, but if anyone has any final consideration. No. So I would like to thank Professor Margot a lot again for inspiring us. And thank you everyone for joining us in this discussion. All the Dialogos Abiertos are available in the Transitions in the Global South YouTube channel. This one will be also available in a few days. And hope to see you joining us on our next meeting that will be shared on the lists, in the email list and the STRN list, everything. So thank you, Diego and Rebecca and Professor Monica for helping us setting this up. And see you in the next time.
Thank you, Diego.
Thank you.
All.
Ciao, ciao. Thank you. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Ciao.